The district of Loomis Hill was the architectural equivalent of a deep-seated grudge. It was all gray stone, wrought iron, and windows that looked like eyes squinting in judgment. It was the wealthiest part of the city, a place where the no-shifter laws weren't just signs on the wall, they were the very foundation of the culture. In the center of this cold, opulent neighborhood sat a storefront with no neon sign, only a gold-leafed emblem etched into the heavy glass. A single needle threaded with a strand of dark purple silk. This was the velvet needle. Inside, the air was pressurized, heavy with the scent of expensive cedarwood, vintage bourbon, and the faint, ozone-heavy aroma of high-end dry cleaning. Julian stood at his ebony cutting table, his movements as fluid and precise as a surgeon's, where he wore a charcoal three-piece suit of his own design, a shadow weave that seemed to absorb the light around him, making his silhouette appear sharper, more defined than the world around him. To the CEOs and politicians who frequented his shop, Julian was a ghost. He was the man who could hide a drinking problem with a perfectly draped lapel, or make a coward look like a king with a reinforced shoulder pad. They saw his gray eyes, the color of a winter sky over a frozen lake, and they felt a strange, instinctive urge to stand up straighter. They didn't know they were standing in the presence of a predator who could tear their throats out before they could reach for their wallets. Julian was an alpha, but he was a city wolf. He had realized long ago that the best way to protect his kind wasn't to howl at the moon in a forest that was being logged to death, but to control the very fabric of the society that hunted them. Julian didn't just sew clothes, he sewed survival. In the secret basement beneath the plush velvet showroom, Julian operated a loom made of ancient rowan wood, salvaged from the site of his pack's first kill 500 years ago. He wove what he called Goliath silk, a thread reinforced with microscopic silver glass and moon-blessed iron. When a shifter wore a Julian bespoke suit, they weren't just dressed for a gala. They were wearing a flexible suit of armor. The lining of his jackets was embroidered with runes of omission, spells that scrambled the thermal sensors used by the Hunter Council and allowed alphas to walk through silver detectors without the metal screaming a warning. He was the tailor to the underground. His stitches were the only thing keeping the city's secret population from a mass grave. On this particular Tuesday, the city was drowning in a relentless, gray rain. Julian was working on a navy cashmere overcoat for an alpha from the docks when the golden chime above the door rang. He didn't look up. His ears, capable of hearing a heartbeat through a brick wall, tracked the intruder. The pulse was high, staccato and frantic, like a bird caught in a chimney. The footsteps were uneven, dragging slightly on the left side. Then the scent hit him. It was a jagged, violent smell. It was the scent of a damp basement, rusted iron, and the metallic, spitter tang of silver nitrate. It was the smell of a hunter's workshop. Julian's hand, holding a pair of heavy brass shears, went perfectly still. The shadow he cast against the wall of silk spools seemed to elongate, the ears of a pointed, lupine beast flickering for a microsecond in the candlelight. "We are closed for private fittings, madame," Julian said, his voice a low, dangerous purr that vibrated in the floorboards. "Please," a woman's voice cracked. Julian turned. Standing in his doorway was a woman who looked like she had survived a shipwreck. Her auburn hair was matted with rain, her trench coat was shredded at the hem, and she was clutching a heavy canvas bundle to her chest with white-knuckled desperation. Julian's nostrils flared. Beneath the stench of the hunter, he smelled something else on her, something pure, like wild jasmine and rain-slicked stone. It was a scent that made the wolf beneath his ribs pace with an unfamiliar, protective hunger. "My father is dead," Clara Thorne whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "He told me if the men in the black SUVs ever came for me, I should find the man with the silver needle. He said you owed him a life. He said you were the only monster left with a conscience." She laid the bundle on the ebony table. As the canvas fell away, Julian felt a phantom pain in his side, a jagged scar across his ribs throbbing in sympathy. It was a hunting jacket, heavy, olive drab, and reinforced with Kevlar. On the shoulder was a patch, a stylized silver crossbow. Julian knew that jacket. He had seen it 20 years ago, through a haze of blood and snow, as the man wearing it fired a silver bolt into Julian's father's chest. The man was Elias Thorne, the most feared hunter in the tri-state area. Elias Thorne was a butcher, Julian hissed, his pupils dilating until his eyes were almost entirely gold. He spent his life turning my brothers into rugs. Why should I help his daughter? Clara didn't flinch. She reached into the pocket of the jacket and pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger. Because he wasn't just hunting you, Julian. He was cataloging the people who were paying him. He realized too late that the council, the judges, the mayors, the men you make suits for, weren't hunting monsters. They were hunting competition. They wanted your land, your gold, and your blood for their private laboratories. She pushed the ledger toward him. He spent the last 5 years of his life as a double agent. This book contains the names of every hunter currently embedded in Loomis Hill. It has the frequencies of their trackers. It has their hit list. Julian reached out, his long, elegant fingers trembling slightly as he touched the leather. The echo of the book was deafening. He could feel the cold cruelty of the names written inside. "And why bring this to me?" Julian asked. "Because the hit list starts with me," Clara said, her eyes locking onto his. "And the second name on the list is yours. They're coming to clean the street, Julian. And they're starting with the needle." The front window of the shop didn't break. It evaporated. A high-frequency sonic pulse shattered the reinforced glass into 1,000,000,000 diamonds. Before the shards had even hit the Persian rug, 4 men in matte black tactical gear swung through the frames on rappelling lines. They were the cleaners, the elite enforcement arm of the Hunter Council. They didn't use bullets. They used liquid silver gas. A canister clattered onto the floor, hissing a foul, metallic mist. To a human, it was a mild irritant. To a shifter, it was acid in the lungs, a poison that forced the body to shift painfully and uncontrollably. "Clara, under the table, now!" Julian roared. His transformation was not the slow, agonizing bone snap of a forest wolf. It was a high society shift, liquid, fast, and terrifyingly efficient. His charcoal jacket tore down the center back seam, revealing a torso of corded silver-gray muscle. His face elongated, his teeth becoming ivory daggers, but he kept his upright bipedal posture. He was a werewolf in a 3-piece suit, a nightmare in bespoke tailoring. Julian grabbed a heavy bolt of lead-lined wool from the shelf and threw it over Clara, shielding her from the gas. The first hunter leveled a pulse rifle. Julian didn't wait, but he moved with the speed of a camera flash. He didn't use his claws. He grabbed his Grandmaster shears. The heavy silver blades, etched with runes of unmaking, snicked through the air with a sound like a guillotine. The hunter's rifle was sliced clean in half. The second snick of the shears took the man's tactical vest. Julian was a whirlwind of charcoal silk and gray fur. He used the environment of the shop as a weapon, and he pulled a strand of steel thread from a spool and whipped it across the room. The wire glowed blue as it sliced through the barrel of another rifle. "You've stained the rug!" Julian growled, his voice a sub-bass rumble that made the remaining glass shards dance on the floor. One hunter managed to fire a dart. It caught Julian in the shoulder. He didn't howl. He grunted, the silver nitrate burning through his veins like liquid fire. His wolf surged, wanting to tear the man's throat out. But Julian held it back with a mental iron fist. He needed to be precise. He needed to be a tailor. He grabbed the hunter by the helmet and slammed him into the ebony cutting table. "Who sent you? Was it the mayor? The council?" The hunter coughed blood onto Julian's white shirt. It doesn't matter. The whole block is cordoned off. You're a relic, Wolf. The city belongs to the Iron now." Julian snapped the man's neck with a clinical flick of his wrist. He turned to the room, yet it was a disaster. His life's work, the silks, The cashmere, the quiet dignity of his craft, was covered in soot and blood. He looked at the dart in his shoulder. He pulled it out, his flesh sizzling as it healed, the silver burn leaving a permanent, jagged mark on his skin. Clara crawled out from under the lead-lined wool, her face pale but her eyes fierce. She looked at the bodies, then at the half-shifted monsters standing over them. "They're coming back, aren't they?" she asked, where Julian looked at his ruined sleeves. The refined Alpha was gone. The general had returned. "Yes," Julian said, his eyes bleeding back from gold to gray. "But they made a tactical error. They came into a shop where every needle is a bayonet and every thread is a garrote." He walked to the back of the shop, to a mirror that looked like an ordinary antique. He pressed a hidden stitch in the velvet wallpaper, and the mirror swung open on silent hinges. Inside was Julian's private hoard. It wasn't gold or jewels. It was rows of suits, dresses, and coats, all shimmering with an iridescent, oily light. This was his war wear. "If we're going to survive the night, Clara, you can't be a civilian anymore," Julian said. He pulled down a long, midnight blue trench coat. It felt like silk, but weighed as much as chainmail. This is woven from the undercoat of a 1,000-year Alpha, and reinforced with spider silk from the deep woods. It will stop a bullet. It will mask your scent from their hounds. He handed it to her. Then he stripped off his ruined waistcoat and donned a jacket made of lupine leather, a material that expanded and contracted with his shift, allowing him to fight in his beast form without losing his protection. "Why are you helping me?" Clara asked, slipping into the coat. It fit her perfectly, as if Julian had been measuring her in his dreams for a lifetime. Julian paused, and his hand on the hilt of a silver-encrusted rapier hidden inside an umbrella. "Your father stole my past, Clara, but you brought me the future. Those names in that ledger? That's not just a hit list, that's a map for a revolution." He stepped closer to her, the scent of jasmine and rain now overwhelming the blood in the room. He reached out, his clawed thumb tracing her jawline. "For 20 years, I've been sewing shrouds for my people. Tonight, I think I'll start sewing banners." The hunters had indeed surrounded the block. 6 SUVs, 20 men, and a mobile command center with thermal imaging. They thought they were flushing out a Tailor. They weren't. The front door of the Velvet Needle opened. Julian stepped out, looking like a god of the new age. He was fully shifted now, 7 feet of silver-gray power, his lupine leather suit shimmering with enchantments that made him look like a blur to the human eye. Beside him stood Clara, her midnight blue coat fluttering in the wind, holding her father's ledger like a holy relic. The lead hunter raised a megaphone. "Julian, surrender the girl and the book! The council has already signed the order. You are an illegal inhabitant of this city." Julian didn't answer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. He threw it into the air. Inside were 1,000 tiny, silver-tipped needles, each one enchanted with a lodestone spell. As they hit the air, they didn't fall. They hovered, then launched toward the hunters' vehicles with the force of armor-piercing slugs. Tires popped, engines seized, the high-tech gear of the cleaners began to malfunction as the needles pierced their circuitry. "Now!" Julian roared. From the rooftops of Loomis Hill, other shadows emerged. The well-dressed pack, the bankers, the lawyers, and the shopkeepers Julian had been outfitting for years, dropped from the heights. They weren't wearing rags, and they were wearing Julian's armor. They were silent. They were efficient. The street turned into a symphony of controlled violence. This wasn't a wild animal attack. It was a military operation. Julian moved through the chaos like a conductor. Every time a hunter tried to aim, Julian's steel thread was there to pull the weapon away or trip the shooter. He found the commander, the man who had led the raid. He was cowering behind the armored door of the command center. Julian didn't use his claws, and he used his shears. He drove the blades through the armored glass, the silver runes glowing with a blinding white light that smelled of lightning. "The problem with you, hunters," Julian growled, pulling the heavy door off its hinges with one hand, "is that you don't understand the importance of a good fit. You're too tight. You're too rigid. You don't know how to adapt to the movement of the world." With a single movement, Julian ended the threat. By the time the sun began to peek over the skyscrapers, the fog was lifting from Loomis Hill. The SUVs were smoking ruins, and the hunters who survived had fled, knowing their names were now in the hands of the alpha they had tried to clean. Julian stood in front of his shattered shop, his lupine leather jacket dusty but intact. Clara stood beside him, her midnight coat untouched by the violence. "What happens now?" she asked, looking at the ledger. Julian looked at the gold-leafed emblem on the broken glass. The needle. The thread. "Now," Julian said, his voice returning to its calm, aristocratic silkiness. "We change the fashion of this city. The no-shifter laws are a threadbare garment, Clara. It's time we ripped it up and started over." He turned to his pack, the men and women who stood among the ruins of the street. They looked to him, their alpha, their Tailor. "Get the brooms," Julian commanded. "And someone find me some more navy cashmere. We have a lot of work to do. A revolution is only as good as its uniform." As the pack moved to obey, Julian turned to Clara. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver thimble. He placed it in her hand. "A gift," he whispered, "for the woman who brought the truth to the needle." Clara looked at the thimble. It was engraved with a single word: reweave. "I don't know how to sew," she admitted. Julian smiled, a genuine, yet warm expression that reached his gray eyes. "Don't worry, little bird. I'm an excellent teacher, and I think you'll find that in this city, knowing how to handle a needle is just as important as knowing how to handle a heart." The story of the Alpha Tailor and the Hunter's Daughter became the founding myth of the new Oakhaven. They weren't just a shop. They were the architects of a new world, one where the monsters wore the finest silk and the hunters were the ones afraid of the dark. And every year, on the anniversary of the Battle of Loomis Hill, Julian would sit at his ebony table, a glass of bourbon in one hand and a needle in the other, sewing a new banner for the pack. Because, as Julian liked to say, a wolf may change his fur, but a Julian suit lasts forever.